So I know this is kind of old news at this point. This started a week ago where Sony was informing its customers that purchased Discovery content that as of December 31st, they can no longer access it, even if they actually paid for it and they bought it to own it. You don't actually own it, sorry. All of your content is going to be removed from your PlayStation console. Now, PlayStation has stopped selling TV shows and movies. I think about a year or two ago, they're kind of moving away from that, but if you purchased it before and you thought that if you bought to own something as opposed to buying to rent, because those were always two options with movies and TV shows on PlayStation. If you decide to rent it, it was like a couple bucks cheaper, and you can only view it once. Well, if you bought to own it, though, the idea, or the thought at least that people had, was that if you bought to own, you actually owned it, but you don't. Users that paid for this content can no longer access it, and that's just it. Like, you can't do anything about it. You have to deal with it. You can't blame people that purchased this content for not realizing this was a possibility, because this is not how licensing works when it comes to video games on PlayStation. If you bought a game on PlayStation, no matter what happens, whether it gets delisted or something happens to it, unless the servers get shut down, it's an online-only game, your access to the game is not just taken away from you and you suddenly don't have it anymore. Like the Avengers game that got delisted about a month or two ago, I can still play it anytime I want, because it does have an offline mode. If it was online only, then I wouldn't be able to, because I think they shut the servers down. If they haven't already, then they will in the very near future. But the common understanding is, if you buy a game digitally, unless your PlayStation account gets banned, or something like that happens, then you don't suddenly just lose your rights to access that content. There actually is a thing that happened lately where supposedly hundreds of PlayStation accounts have been suddenly banned, and there's no explanation for it, but people acting like this is a PlayStation-only thing that happens, they're clowns. I am really frustrated with people on both sides of the console war. I mean, that usually is the thing when it comes to most of these things, but it's just ridiculous. The Sony fanboys just saying, oh, well, this is a Discovery problem. This has nothing to do with Sony. If Sony could, they would have people still access the content and there'd be no problems. You have to blame this all on Discovery. Except an agreement takes place between two parties. Discovery didn't hold a gun to Sony's head and say they had to agree to these terms. Terms that made the customer think that they had any sort of rights to this content that was permanent. Like, yeah, you could say whatever you want about the terms and conditions. Oh, read the terms and conditions. Who the fuck actually does that? In reality, nobody does. So, yeah, in the small fine print, you'll see something that says, oh no, you don't actually own the right to this content. You have a license to access it, which can be revoked at any moment. Now, legally, Sony and Discovery are probably not going to have any issues when it comes to this. But just from a moral perspective, and just talking about who's right and who's wrong, both parties are at fault here. Sony and Discovery. It's not just Discovery, not just Sony, both of them. But Sony definitely deserves a lot more blame than a lot of these PlayStation fanboys are giving them. Because at the end of the day, Sony, they're at fault because they knowingly chose to host and sell Discovery's content, fully aware that the license would eventually expire, leading to the removal of the content from the customers who had purchased it. There is no justification for this. There is no trying to defend Sony, trying to say that they did absolutely nothing wrong here. Like, no, I'm not going to accept that. Like this tweet over here from this dude I've never heard of before, which is most people I see on Twitter, says that's a Discovery issue, and it impacts every digital store that sold Discovery content that's no longer licensed. Pretending it's PlayStation when they're notifying you of what Discovery is doing is peak comprehension deficiency. Yeah, comprehension deficiency. That's what it is on our part. We should have known that when we buy content on PlayStation, it magically exists in some alternate reality in the multiverse of madness or some shit, where Sony, it's just outside the realm of Sony's control. They have nothing to do with the content that they sell. Like, shut the fuck up. Sony is not an innocent bystander here. They agreed to these terms, they knew what these terms meant for their customers, and they went through with it anyway. But people are somehow unable to comprehend this basic fact. That is the real comprehension deficiency here. You got another guy here defending Sony. PlayStation isn't deleting anything. Their rights to certain shows with Discovery are apparently over, and now PlayStation has no right to stream that content. fuck your clickbait. That was in response to a New York Times article that said in the title that Sony is deleting Discovery shows from people's PlayStation consoles. And that's clickbait? It's what's actually happening. Like, are you really that dense to not realize the crux of the issue here? Okay, yeah, it's accurate to say that PlayStation may not be directly responsible for the expiration of content rights with Discovery. Like, they didn't say, yeah, you know what? We don't want more content rights with Discovery, and we're just going to let it expire. It probably was Discovery having more of a hand in that deal ending than Sony did. Sure, I might give you that, but the crucial aspect here is how the platform manages such transitions. The lack of access to certain shows really points to a broader issue within the digital content landscape, the vulnerability of consumer rights in the face of licensing agreements. So the question arises, how well did PlayStation and Sony communicate this change to its users? Well, they gave their customers a 30-day notice and just said, yeah, on this day, you can't watch this content anymore. It's going to be deleted from your console, and that's it. You can't watch these shows anymore. You can't watch these movies, whatever content that you did purchase from Discovery. You don't have it anymore. Even though you thought that you owned it, you don't. You actually don't. Was Sony fully clear and transparent when you went to purchase a TV show or movie from their console and you clicked the option buy to own on the PlayStation Store? Did Sony effectively communicate to its users that your ownership rights for a TV show or movie was fundamentally different for how ownership rights worked for a video game on PlayStation? Aside from burying it deep within the terms and conditions of PlayStation, they did not communicate this at all. The vast majority of people that bought these things on a PlayStation or any other platform that sold TV shows and movies didn't think that this content could just suddenly be revoked from them at any moment that these companies saw fit. So the dynamic of digital content ownership, and that's in heavy air quotes here, it raises concerns about the transient nature of access to said content, and this incident serves as a reminder for both consumers and platforms to evaluate the resilience and transparency of their content distribution models, because it clearly wasn't transparent to a lot of people that once this licensing agreement expired, that meant that they no longer had access to this content. You see, there's a lot of people that clearly were not aware of that. And again, you can go back to terms and agreements and all that shit that nobody reads. It's really, there was a clear lack of transparency here, and nobody can tell me otherwise. Anybody trying to defend Sony in this situation is just outing themselves as a corporate bootlicker, doing free HR and damage control for a multi-billion-dollar corporation that I could see if they were on Sony's payroll, but no, they're just doing this for free because they are blindly loyal and dedicated to a corporation that doesn't give a shit about them as a person. The sole purpose of a corporation is to generate profit, not to make people happy. So that's my stance on the Sony people defending this. But just because that's my position when it comes to the Sony fanboys doesn't mean that I think the Xbox fanboys are completely off the hook in this situation either. They are, in my opinion, just as insufferable as the Sony people, because the Sony people, you know, they're pathetic because they're defending these companies that don't give a shit about them, and they're not even on their payroll, but they still just, like, they spend so much time of their life just arguing with people on Twitter and making YouTube videos, and it's just like, come on, stop. But I think it's hilarious that the Xbox people think that they have a right to dunk on Sony in this case. The case of content ownership, that's the key thing here. And that's why people are, you know, that's why Sony is getting a lot of negative press, because they're pretty much saying, yeah, like, you don't actually own the rights to this content at all, and we can take it from you any moment we can. So the Xbox fanboys like, yeah, bad news about Sony, that means Xbox is better, right? Well, in the case of content ownership, I don't think so. Like, is the irony not completely lost on these people? The same people that say that Game Pass is such an amazing thing, and how it's the second coming of Jesus Christ, the greatest thing since sliced fucking bread. Game Pass, Game Pass, Game Pass is all they fucking talk about. But what is Game Pass? Game Pass is a subscription Netflix-like model where your rights to any content is determined on two things. One is that you continue paying your subscription every month, which is, anywhere from $10 a month to $20 a month, and over time, obviously, that's going to get more and more expensive. And if you stop paying that subscription, then you don't have access to any of those games anymore. So that's one thing that determines your right to any content that's on Game Pass. The other thing is if the game is even still part of the Game Pass subscription. Like, when it comes to first-party titles from Microsoft, it's a pretty safe bet that none of those games are just going to come off of Game Pass. Like, I wouldn't expect Halo Infinite or when Elder Scrolls 6 comes out, that to just be taken out of Game Pass. Call of Duty, all that shit is safe, but a lot of these other games that are part of the Game Pass service, they come and go every month. Every month there's new games added and more games that are taken away. But when that game is taken away, what happens? Well, you no longer have access to that game because it's not on Game Pass anymore. It's like if you're binging a show in the middle of a season on Netflix, but the show leaves Netflix. You can't continue watching just because you already made progress on it. No, you're shit out of luck. That's how it works with streaming, So it's just amazing how the very individuals that herald Xbox as superior because of what happened between Sony and Discovery, where people are losing access to their content, are often the ones subscribing to a service that exemplifies a shift away from traditional content ownership. Like, hey, if that's your thing, fine, but you really have no right to criticize Sony in this case. You really don't. Game Pass, some people like it, some people don't. If you like it, that's fine, but you have to recognize that in the context of this conversation, Game Pass is something that undermines the very idea of ownership rights. Subscribers don't possess the games they play. They're granted access as long as they maintain their subscription. This model contrasts starkly with the traditional sense of purchasing digital content, where ownership implies enduring access. It implies, doesn't always confirm it, and when we're talking about the Sony and Discovery thing. But for the most part, like when we're talking about games, like actual games, we're talking about a gaming console, right? With games, you don't just lose access to that game unless you're banned from PlayStation or banned from Xbox or whatever. Then, yeah, you lose your rights to your games, and that is another point of concern, but that's something that happens on every platform. Like, you get all your games taken away if you're considered a bad actor, and they ban you from their service. So, when I see Xbox, like this guy tweeting, oh, my condolences to anyone who bought a PlayStation 5, and this guy, if I only played on PlayStation, I'd be really concerned about an all-digital future. This is bad, and it's crazy no one is talking about it. Okay, well, plenty of people are talking about it. This is really big news, but as far as only playing on PlayStation, I mean, as opposed to what? Only playing on Xbox? Yeah, you have so much more rights to your content on Xbox. On PC? I mean, hey, I'm a PC guy. You guys know that. But PC? Definitely not. It's all digital. There is no such thing as physical ownership. And even platforms like GOG that have DRM-free digital games that they sell, most games don't end up on GOG. Probably because of that policy. I guess maybe with Nintendo you can make a case, but they're not the most consumer-friendly people either. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of physical ownership, a lot more on Nintendo than any other platform right now, but their prices are just so ridiculous and absurd. They never come down no matter what. Like, maybe there'll be a sale every now and then, but like the game that's like 5 years old is still $60, and they're charging $70 for these new games that are not technologically any better. It's still the original Switch, like Tears of the Kingdom. So, like, I don't consider Nintendo to be, like, a much better company than Sony and Microsoft. Not really. And even they're starting to move towards digital subscription models. Like, these NES games that come out are tied to a subscription. When you stop paying that subscription, you don't have the games anymore. So the idea that only playing on PlayStation is, like, such a huge concern and you're more vulnerable to getting your content access revoked, what is the alternative? What is the best alternative? Because they're all bad. Especially Xbox, where the entire brand and identity surrounding Xbox, it's all Game Pass now. That's Microsoft's main focus right now. It's their big play. They want a future in which everybody is playing games through a subscription service, not traditional, you pay $60, $70 for a new game. No. Their main objective, which has become very apparent, when you talk about the leaked documents that came out a couple months ago, their entire strategy is Game Pass. That is what their entire focus is. They want everybody to be playing Game Pass, and that to be the main way that everybody consumes content. So how can you say that Sony is so awful in this one particular issue when Microsoft wants to completely throw content ownership out the window and be completely non-existent? Like, there's no way around it. That's what they're trying to do here. And like I said in many previous videos before, don't be surprised if within the next couple of years there's going to be certain titles that are Game Pass only. Like, you can't even buy them separately to own. It's only on Game Pass, and you have to be subscribed in order to ever be able to play the game. I am 10 times more confident about the fact that Game Pass is going to cause serious damage and harm to the quality and integrity of video games. Way more confident than I was back in 2021 when I made that video saying that Stadia was going to shut down by 2023, and it did. And that was an easy prediction to make. This is even easier. This is definitely going to happen. Fuck Game Pass. So it's paradoxical to witness the enthusiasm of these Xbox fanboys celebrating a supposed triumph over Sony's content access woes when they themselves are part of a system that exemplifies a shift towards a less ownership-centric gaming experience. It's sad that this entire discussion has been hijacked into another talking point in this console war bullshit when it should be more about the evolving nature of content distribution and the implications that it has for user rights and long-term access. And I'm just seeing this happen more and more over time with these very important topics that have huge implications for like everybody that plays video games, but it's just turning into a shit-flinging contest between people that are very insecure about their spending decision to the point where, like, any other electronic toy out there that is not the one that they bought, oh, you have to discredit it every single chance that you get. It's beyond pathetic. You know, to be fair, if you're like a 13-year-old boy in junior high school that is doing this shit and arguing it with your classmates and your friends, it's a lot different than a 35-year-old man on Twitter that is supposed to, like, have a full-time job and a family that they're spending so much time. They are so fixated in participating in this digital dick measuring contest. Mine's bigger than yours, mine's better than yours. Well, if it really was, you wouldn't feel the need to constantly talk about it, would you? And we're still talking about game consoles here, right? Yes. It should speak for itself. Stop bitching and start playing. That's what games are meant to be, played, not argued about on Twitter.